Vermont Electric Cooperative, lighting the path to affordable clean energy together.
That a very steep ramp, almost a vertical ramp at times of all that load coming right back on. And the impact that this can have is it's changing the load shape that we're trying to predict and hit with our resources. And it can also shift the peak hour, that snapback load, as I refer to it, can shift the peak hour to that hour when all those devices do come back online.
Welcome to Vermont Electric Cooperative's virtual power plant series, Sweet Watts, where we focus on the people, learnings, and strategy of our VPP programs. I'm your host, Cyril Brunner, and in this episode, I'm joined by Dan Potter, who works at VEC. We focus on what VPP grid services are valuable to VEC today, with a particular focus on peak shaving, the resources we use, and the challenges we face. The term virtual power plants can be confusing and is often used differently across the industry. In my opinion, it's how we aggregate distributed energy resources to provide a variety of grid services. Those aggregated resources include behind-the-meter batteries, electric vehicles, smart buildings, and distributed generation like solar. VEC is currently managing 464 devices with a total management capability of 3.1 megawatts. That includes around 300 EV chargers and 65 electric vehicles, which is an average load reduction of around 1 kilowatt for up to 5 hours. We manage roughly half of the total EVs that are installed on the system. We also have over 120 behind-the-meter batteries, providing around 600 kilowatts total for around 2 to 3 hours. The average size per battery in VEC's territory is around 9 kilowatts or 23 kilowatt hours, and VEC manages around 40% of the total home batteries. We also have 2 smart buildings with a total capability of around 350 kilowatts, and depending on the time of year and what that looks like, that number can vary. Those are dispatched for around 2 to 4 hours. And then we have one megawatt, 4 megawatt hour utility scale battery. It's our Heinsberg utility scale battery. And it's also worth mentioning that VEC has around 35 megawatts of distributed solar. We don't have direct connections to those devices and really aren't managing those as a result today. We are absolutely looking at ways to integrate those into the various VPP services that are out there. There's a big list of grid services that VPPs can provide. Locally, VPPs like VEC's Bring Your Own Home Battery program can improve resiliency by eliminating the impacts of distribution or transmission outages. They can provide voltage support in the case of solar inverters, and as a result, enable more renewable generation on the system. And there are regional use cases in the example of GMP's Tesla Powerwalls, which participate in frequency regulation markets at the ICE in New England. And in Texas, there's a variety of VPPs that provide value to utilities and consumers through energy arbitrage. Today, we're using VPPs to reduce peaks by dispatching home batteries or shifting load like EVs in buildings. They also provide us with key data, kilowatts, and in some cases voltage, that enables situational awareness for our control center operators and folks at Valco and ICE New England. As we look forward, we're building the foundations to be able to defer over $100 million worth of infrastructure impacts by managing VPP resources like EVs and batteries. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with Dan. I'm very excited to welcome today's guest, Dan Potter, who is power supply analyst at Vermont Electric Cooperative. Dan has a variety of roles at VEC, including power supply contracts, rec arbitrage, and helping administrate our VPP programs. Dan is the guy who pushes the button. We do have one of those guys here at VEC, and he dispatches the DR resources when we have peak events. And he also puts together a variety of financial models to justify our programs, all of which we'll talk in more detail today. Thanks for being on Sweet Watts, Dan.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Let's dig right into it. Talk to me a little bit about your background. How did you find your way into the energy industry and what brought you to VEC?
Sure. I've always been a little interested in energy. I minored in green building while at the University of Vermont and actually had the pleasure in the past few years of building a very efficient home, which was great to see that come full circle. After college, I spent a few years in local planning, working with municipalities on energy planning. In part, that led to a job at the State Department of Public Service. They're our ratepayer advocate here in Vermont, as well as the State Energy Planning Office. Part of my responsibilities there were related to approving plans, energy plans for municipalities. But then I also was tasked with working on traditional rate cases, and that's kind of how I got into the power supply end of things and what led me ultimately to Vermont Electric Co-op and my current role as a power planning analyst.
Awesome. Yeah, and you joined us like right at the start of the pandemic, which was, I'm sure, an exciting career change, both in reality and also just the way the world was at that point in time.
It was a challenging time to change jobs, that's for certain.
Yeah,
It was hard to get to meet folks, really.
definitely. Definitely. We're gonna obviously dive deep into power supply and financials, but I like to ask this question of what's one thing that you're most passionate about outside of your career in energy?
Yeah, well, it's summertime here, and that means I can be found mountain biking. That's something I'm passionate about. I actually spent the weekend learning how to build and maintain mountain bike trails.
Nice. And you're also on the board of a local mountain bike organization, right?
Yeah, the Waterbury Area Trails Alliance. If you're not a member, join up.
Yeah. Shout out Keith, right? Shout out Keith. Okay. Um, what makes VC so unique in the co-op space? From a power supply standpoint, transmission cost standpoint, what sticks out in your head?
Yeah, one of the first things is that when all of our surrounding states deregulated, I forget when that was, maybe in the 2000s, Vermont did not go down that path. So VEC is still a vertically integrated utility. And what I mean by that is we can own generation and all of our distribution assets, right? In other parts of the country, you have co-ops, which are just a distribution entity, and then they rely on a G&T for the generation and power supply aspect of things.
Speaking of generation, touch a little bit on like what does that look like for us? Like, do we own any generation assets?
We do not currently own any generation assets. All of our power supply contracts are done through power purchase agreements or PPAs. And we have a handful of reasons for that. One is it's a little less risky, but it also requires a lot less capital expenditure from our ratepayers.
Yeah, probably also worth mentioning that we were burned back in the 90s on a big nuclear kind of project that went south and caused us to go into bankruptcy. So that definitely adds to that sort of hesitancy. So we touched a little bit on power procurement. How about transmission costs and what does that look like in our region, given the relationship with Velco?
So Velco, the Vermont Electric Power Company, is the transmission entity in the state of Vermont. And what's a little unique about this arrangement is that all of the distribution utilities in the state of Vermont own Velco. And then what makes most of these programs work is how the capacity and transmission related costs are assessed on the utilities in the region. And it's really based on each utility's share of load during the 13 hours of the year, the 1 hour that the ISO New England system peaks each year, and then the 12 hours, 1 hour each month that the Vermont system peaks each year. These programs, the way we make money from these programs is we lower our load in those 13 hours, hopefully, if we predict them successfully, and that lowers our costs.
Nice. And those are direct pass through, right? Like we don't have like a G&T unlike a lot of co-ops. Those costs like come straight through and are impacting our bottom line, basically.
Correct.
Yep. On the justification of those programs, so what is that value for VC? So we have two kind of primary areas of programs, or three, I guess now: EV batteries and smart buildings, which are all justified through peak transmission savings. What is that value for VC and how's it calculated?
Yeah, good question. Ballpark for transmission costs right now is about $15 per kilowatt month. So if we lower our load by 1 kilowatt, we will save $15 per month, roughly speaking. That's transmission only. The most recent capacity auction cleared at about $3.58 per kilowatt month. And that's the other area of savings that we can realize if we lower our load in the 1 hour that the ISO New England system peaks each year. And so the way that works, if we're successful, we lower our load by 1 kilowatt in the 1 hour ISO peaks. The year following that summer, ISO is a summer peaking system. We usually peak June, July, or August. But the following year after that, we would have bill savings for the 12-month capacity commitment period. And the way our programs work, when I'm preparing these models, these financial models, we're projecting out about 10 years or more, sometimes given the life of the program or the life of the asset that we're looking at. And so we're making some assumptions about how these values are going to sugar off over time in the out years. We know the capacity market 3+ years out. We don't necessarily know the R&S rates that far. We have some forecasts, but you know what they say about forecasts.
Yeah. I think everyone knows that. As someone who's like relatively new in the power supply space, I've spent a lot of time in the technology space and engineering space. These terms get thrown around fairly frequently of like RNS, FCM. Tie those back to ISO New England and transmission and the monthly pieces just clearly. I think there's like a lot of folks out there who hear those terms and have a hard time associating them with which peak we're talking about.
Yeah, happy to do so. So FCM, it's your forward capacity market. It's administered by ISO New England. And when I say FCM savings, I'm really talking about the 1 hour that the ISO New England system peaks each year. Because the way that market works is based on your load in that hour. So for example, in July of 2024, ISO New England is going to look at our load, and if it peaked on July 22nd, 2024, they would look at our load in that hour and then assess us a portion of the capacity, the forward capacity market costs. We lower our load in that hour, we achieve savings in our forward capacity market related costs next year. And then you also mentioned RNS, that's regional network service. That is related to the 12 hours that I was speaking about, the 1 hour each month of the year that the Vermont system peaks. And those are transmission related costs. And it's, the concept is much the same. If we can lower our load in every one of those hours, we will save money each month. And that's a monthly bill, right? Yeah. Whereas the 1 hour that the ISO New England system peaks, though that proportion is passed on for an entire year, a whole 12-month period. Yeah. Whereas the RNS changes month to month.
And for those people who are watching on YouTube, I'm probably going to put this up there because these are questions that we get asked a lot, especially as we're trying to kind of identify the value of programs. I think that's a space that we've learned, is that vendors are often unsure of what that value is. And really that's a starting point for us, right? Like that is the total value of these programs. We make assumptions on a lot of other things as it relates to those programs, but those values are fairly fixed, and we try and share some with the members enrolled in the programs, but then also try to maximize the total value and savings to the membership, right? And that can be one of the things that we navigate. You touched on making assumptions on RNS and FCM. Can you touch on what are the other assumptions that we do generally in these EV and battery programs as an example?
Yeah, so I'll try to go in order of importance, or a rough order of importance, right? So we have our forecasted market values for the forward capacity market, the regional network service rates, and there's a bunch of other kind of ancillary rates that also get tied in there. The next biggest assumption is probably your success rate that you predict at hitting the forward capacity market, the 1 hour that ISO peaks, as well as the RNS peaks, the monthly peaks for the Vermont system. That forecasted success rate can have a large impact on your model and the financial benefit. Some of the other assumptions, program costs. So the kind of enabling costs, I like to refer to them as. If there's software needed to stand a program up, that can eat a chunk of that total pie that you were talking about, right? We have that total pie. We need to split it between participating members, non-participating members, and then any enabling costs. And the last assumption I'll touch on here for folks is the percentage share between participating and non-participating members. That can also have a large impact on the model. And the big consideration here is the amount of money you're passing on to a participating member sufficient to entice them, incentivize them to take the action that you're asking them to take, right? So our EV program is a perfect example. We are enrolling folks, trying to enroll folks in that program, and we're saying we will give you this monthly bill credit in exchange for allowing VEC to manage your charging. If you're giving them $1 per month to manage their EV charging, that's probably not a good value proposition for your member. But $5, $8, $10 that ballpark is something that may incentivize folks to enroll. And so adjusting that percentage that you're sharing with them can have an impact on the success of the program.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that you and I spend a good amount of time on, I feel like, is like, what is the assumed kilowatts we get from devices, right? And I was thinking about your comment on success rates. Let's focus on EV chargers first. I think one of the things that I hear fairly frequently is just like, what can you count on for an EV? What does that look like for VEC as it relates to, because not all of these EVs are charging at the same time, right? Like some folks plug in at 4 and might only need an hour charge. Others might be charging through the night. What does that look like on average from a program standpoint for us? What number do we use?
Yeah, we assume 1 kilowatt of demand reduction per EV when we call on them for a dispatch event. And we arrived at that number by looking at a couple of years worth of EV charging data and trying to look at an all hours average of demand, obviously removing the times that we had called on those folks to curtail their charging.
Do you anticipate that number increasing over time?
I would think so. I think there's a couple of factors there that are going to increase that over time. I think as folks become more comfortable with electric vehicles and using them as a daily driver, you're going to have more charging on the system. I think the vehicle types that have been put out onto the system to date are, it's starting to change, but previously you thought of an EV, most people thought of a small sedan like a Prius or something like that, right? And you now have the Ford Lightning on the system, and I have a Ford Lightning, and I charge that thing a lot because it's not a very efficient electric vehicle. It's a great electric vehicle, but it's not a very efficient one.
It's a boat. We all know that.
It's a boat. Yep. And so as electric vehicles penetrate further and further into the vehicle market and different vehicle types like SUVs and light duty pickup trucks, I think you're going to see more charging and more demand on the system. And I do think that number will go up over time.
Yeah. How about power walls? I know, that's been a program that we've had around for a good amount of time. I think 2019, 2020 is when we first started our Powerwall program. I believe we have something like a little over 100 batteries installed there. What's the typical average size? And also talk to me a little bit about some of the challenges that you might see potentially in the winter months with those.
Yeah, of course. So a single Tesla Powerwall is a 5 kilowatt, 13.5 kilowatt hour system. So it has a 5 kilowatt inverter. You see, we have a number of homeowners within our territory that have 2 Powerwalls within their home. So they'll have 10 kilowatts and 27 kilowatt hours. In regards to your question about winter months, prior to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, if a homeowner wanted to take advantage of the investment tax credit at their home for a storage device, they had to pair that storage device with a solar array. And they also promised the IRS under those rules that they would only charge that storage device from the solar array for the first 5 years of its life. And so in practice, what that's looked like is I believe the installers have been tying the input of the battery to the output of the solar array. And so in the winter months here in Vermont, we may have a week, you have a snowstorm and then 7 days of clouds. And what that means is recharging that battery after VEC is called on it in the winter months can be very difficult. Now, that's only a chunk of our current systems. After the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the rules changed. So new enrollees in the program who have taken advantage of the investment tax credit in the last year or so don't have that same requirement. So their systems can be grid charged. It's been a challenge for us to kind of track those down and make sure that those settings are done correctly. And so we have to work pretty closely with the installers to make sure that they're aware of those settings and that when folks are enrolling in the program, they are set up appropriately and allowed to grid charge and allowed to export that battery's power to the grid. That's another setting. And that setting is actually controlled specifically by the installer, not the homeowner or VEC. And so we do have to work with the installer in that specific instance.
Yep. Talk to me a little bit about why VC went the route of like bring your own device. I know our good friends Green Mountain Power, who we work with closely on a lot of this kind of work and learn from certainly. Have kind of a dual program. They have a bring your own device program, but they also lease out batteries. What's been the primary driver of us starting with a bring your own device program for the last few years?
Yeah, I think largely the capital expenditure required to set up a lease type program. In talking to battery providers, they want commitments to purchase a certain number of batteries, whether that's 100 or 300 or 500 batteries. That's a fairly expensive capital outlay for a small co-op like VEC. So we decided to go the bring your own device route because we felt it avoided that capital outlay and allowed us to bring devices into the program, manage them, and harvest that very similar, almost same value stream. Right.
Yeah,
The
and
one,
a quicker ROI too often, right? Like, all we're really paying for is the software costs and the participation side of things. We have less risk in that standpoint, right? Like who knows what's
yes.
going to happen in the battery market, the peak market, what's going to happen to those battery devices. Just lower risk, similar value for us. We don't have as many devices deployed, but on a percentage basis, we're still doing fairly well. Probably also worth mentioning that we received some state grant funding to do some low moderate income battery storage sites. I think we're projecting around 50 to 75 of those locations. There'll probably be 1 to 2 batteries each between that 5 and 10 kilowatt range. And then, we are adding close to 100 to 120 EV chargers on an annual basis. We have a good portion, 50 to 100, that are still in the progress of getting enrolled. So theoretically, that EV number could be close to 300 by year end if we get all those devices installed and enrolled. So
Certainly. And your comment with respect to grant funding and deploying batteries, that grant funding overcame the capital challenge that we were seeing earlier. And so this will actually be a program whereby VEC owns those assets. It'll be a foot in that door, and we'll actually be able to compare the two programs. So I'm excited for that as well, to see if there is any substantial difference between the two.
That's right. That's right. And one of the things that I guess we didn't touch on is by owning the battery, we may have potentially more opportunity to leverage that asset than we do in a bring your own device scenario. Because of that ownership structure, there might be more events that we can call. We can leverage that battery potentially, more flexibly than we would our bring your own device program, which leads us perfectly into this next piece, which is peak prediction, which is a very critical component. Obviously having devices to manage is great, but if you're unable to predict the peaks and dispatch those resources, you might not make the full use, get the full value of those assets. So talk to me about peak prediction. What do we do today? And maybe towards the end, touch on how that's going and if it's been getting harder over time.
Sure. So what our process to date is, myself and Craig Keeney and Katie Orst, a couple other folks in the power supply and transmission area here at VC, we'll kind of huddle up. We use a variety of data points. We look at weather data from weather.com or weather.gov. We'll also look at some predictive services that we have contracted for. So we have Dynamic Organics and Camus pulling together some peak predictions. And so we'll look at all three of those sources. We'll kind of synthesize that information and talk about it and make our peak calls.
What does those peak calls look like? Like, do you dispatch all the resources at once? Do you kind of like look at a variety of times, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do not dispatch all of our resources equally across the board. And the reason for that is that the various resources have varying constraints on them. So take, for example, the Heinsberg battery that I was just discussing. We contract for 1 megawatt, 4 megawatt hours of that battery, and we're able to use that for 400 hours per year. We're a little more liberal calling that resource than we are the power walls. And you touched on one of the reasons for that earlier. We have a good chunk of our program, probably over 75% of the current enrollees in the program are in that portion of folks who can only recharge their devices from solar. So in the winter months, we're really careful about how and when we call those devices because they may not recharge for a week or two. And so that's one pretty obvious distinction between the utility scale battery, which we could call 20 days in the month of December, for example. And we may only call the Powerwalls 2 days that month. And the EV chargers kind of fall in between the two of those. We'll use them more frequently, more liberally than the home batteries, but less frequently than the utility scale battery. And, the way I think about the EV chargers is really there's a large window to charge your EV in the overnight hours. Most folks, I think the average Vermonter drives 30 miles a day. So you're going to be able to recharge your vehicle in a couple of hours, a handful at most. And so if your charger doesn't start until 10 o'clock or midnight, on most days, unless you're doing back-to-back days of significant amount of driving, you're going to have plenty of time in the overnight hours to recharge that vehicle. And so that's why we often will feel comfortable calling those EV chargers multiple days in a row.
Yeah, and that definitely ties into the data we're seeing. I think our average charging session, right, is like 2 to 4 hours. So to your point on that flexibility within those EVs, it's fairly significant. So my kind of second part of the initial question was, so we're doing all this, whether it's just weather data and looking at that with the team using predictive services, how are we doing on peak shaving? Is that getting more difficult? What sort of actions are from others are impacting that?
Yeah, it is getting more difficult as more and more folks, more and more utilities get into the distributed energy resources and utility scale device management, right? They're starting to change the load shape that we see on the system. And so you can actually look at a dispatch day. May 22nd of this past month is a perfect example. The load's ramping up, and then you hit the time that everybody's calling events, 5 p.m., and you can see us drop right off. And then, and this would be a great spot for a visual, a slide later. And then 9 o'clock, 4 hours later, or 3 hours later, you can see that a very steep ramp, almost a vertical ramp at times of all that load coming right back on. And the impact that this can have is it's changing the load shape that we're trying to predict and hit with our resources. And it can also shift the peak hour, that snapback load, as I refer to it, can shift the peak hour to that hour when all those devices do come back online. And so that definitely happened last month. It was a perfect example of what I've just been discussing. And that I think is going to continue to happen. And I think the DUs in Vermont, Massachusetts, other parts of the ISO New England region are going to start to have to look at kind of feathering resources back in.
How does it make it more difficult? Like these actions, I'm thinking of like Massachusetts, for instance, has put significant incentives on utility scale battery resources. In Vermont, we're challenged with Green Mountain Power as, being significantly larger than us, therefore having significantly more resources at play. How are their actions, how do we navigate those sorts of pieces when we really don't have a ton of visibility into what they're doing, right? We're trying to kind of guess as best as we can. How do you see that like changing in the future, if at all?
Well, we need to use the flexibility within our resources, right? And by that I mean, instead of a 2-hour dispatch with an EV charger, we may want to use a 4-hour dispatch or a 5-hour dispatch. Or if we're using telematics, for example, and we know the state of charge, and we know this person plugged in at 9 p.m. with an 80% state of charge, they don't have very much charging to do. They don't need to turn back on till 4 a.m. really, or even later to get to a 90% charge where they want to be. And so we may be able to use data sources like that to elongate our peak calls with respect to EVs specifically, right? If we have state of charge data. Then also bring in a variety of flexible load resources. We had talked about our CNI There are some buildings that could ride through for 4, 5, 6 hours. So we have some longer duration assets that I would like to see come into the program to give us some diversity of assets in our flexible load management programs. But then also we just try to be cognizant of the situation that I just described a little bit earlier, where the actions of other utilities may have pushed that hour 1 hour later. So we called our battery to cover that kind of 9 to 10 p.m. hour, because we felt that the risk was on the back side of that window and not the front side of that window.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we're trying to flatten out the load. So like the flatter it gets, right, the more likely is that it's going to get harder to find and predict when that time is. Maybe it occurs at 3 a.m. Maybe it occurs at 9 a.m. At some point we're going to get there. I don't think we're close to being that good at managing the peaks, but that probably is the direction that things are headed in, right? If we have so many assets to be able to manage, especially during low load times, which we're kind of in right now between the kind of May, June time period and then the fall. Vermont's loads are generally fairly low, right? Not a lot of air conditioning, not a lot of heating load. And if you have a lot of dispatchable resources like EVs and batteries, you could be having a fairly high portion of that load be able to be managed.
Yeah. And the other piece I'll touch on briefly here is solar resources. We have a lot of distributed solar in Vermont, and so cloud cover can have a big impact on the shape of our load on a day-to-day basis, and in ISO New England, generally speaking, right? We had a couple of years back, we had a much earlier than anticipated ISO New England system peak because cloud cover rolled in earlier than most folks thought it would.
Yeah, and typically, right, we dispatch our resources 4 to 9, right? If all of a sudden something happens at 3 or 2 p.m., chances are we weren't really thinking and considering that.
Yeah. Yep. And so that's something we try to take into account, right, when we're looking at those weather forecasts, things like that. When a thunderstorm rolls through and a heat wave, when a thunderstorm rolls through, that can just kill load right there. And so those are all things we're taking into consideration when we're making our peak predictions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a couple of years ago, right, didn't we have we had a scenario where a thunderstorm rolled through and knocked out a couple of our substations, and that was probably one of the better performing months that we had, not because people had power, unfortunately, but because we were able to shift a significant amount of load. So a little bit of win on one hand, unfortunate for those members who were out of power during that time period.
Yeah. The best thing for Vermont would be a region-wide heat wave, and then thunderstorms, or the heat wave breaks in Vermont before it breaks in Mass and Connecticut, right? So loads stay high down there, loads drop in Vermont.
Yeah. Race to the bottom, as they say. So, we touched a lot on peak management, which, for us is the primary. There's a lot of grid services out there, right? Potentials for VPP to do all kinds of cool things. For us, our programs are based almost exclusively on peak management. We do get some situational awareness value, EV chargers, for instance, providing us some visibility into the system. Other DERs providing us with some good data that we can use. But by and large, the programs are based off of peak management. Now, in other parts of the country, some of these other values are fairly significant. Next, I quickly wanted to touch on energy arbitrage. Just for reference, the average real-time price for wholesale power in the ISO New England region in 2023 was $35.70 a megawatt hour. That might fluctuate up to $40, $45 maybe in the worst case scenario. But in other parts of the country, like Texas, for instance, evening power prices in July and August are trading up to $400 a megawatt hour, right? So just significantly more value in other parts of the country. I know some of the Southwest areas have similar sorts of value. What does that look like for us? And do you anticipate that changing into the future in the ISO New England region? Do you anticipate more variability, perhaps with greater amounts of renewable resources on the market?
Yeah, I'll answer your second question first. I do think there is going to be more dynamic LMPs, locational marginal prices, in the ISO New England system as more DERs come onto the system. So I do think this will change over time, right? You'll have greater variability, and the potential for energy arbitrage is likely to increase over time. Right now, we don't view it as a very large value stream from these type of programs. I mean, you may get some value out of it, but for context, when I'm modeling a single power wall coming into the program on a financial model, we do include the energy arbitrage, and it's really just a function of we assume the general hours that we are dispatching that device and the LMPs for those hours, and then we apply a ratio by looking at historical trends to the hours in which we expect the battery to recharge, so that we can say, on average, we expect LMPs and recharge hours to be 60% of the LMPs in the charging hours. And so just by virtue of operating a program for peak management, we are conducting some energy arbitrage. But for scale, over the course of a year, that may be a $20 benefit from a single Tesla Powerwall. So it's not a large value stream for us currently.
Yeah, I mean, something hopefully that we can stack in the future, right? I think today it's not as valuable, but who knows what the future holds. And having those assets out there means that we could theoretically change how they're being utilized in the future.
Yep, correct.
One other that often gets thrown out is frequency regulation. So GMPs, batteries, at least a portion of them, are currently being dispatched aggregate resource-wise into the frequency regulation market. Our Heinsberg battery, that owner also plays in that frequency regulation market when we are not using that for peak shaving. What's been our role in that frequency regulation market? What have we done?
Yeah, we have not participated in the frequency regulation market to date, and that's a function of, I think, two major things. One, we don't own the asset. To your point, on a utility scale, we don't own the Heinsberg battery that you just referenced, and so we only call that device for peak events. And when we are not using it, the owner and operator of that battery does have that battery in the frequency regulation market. Secondly, it's a fairly time-intensive process to bid that resources into the frequency regulation market, pull them back out for peak events, put them back in after the peak event is over, right? Recharge that device. And so VEC as a small co-op just hasn't had the staff resources needed to really play around with owning a resource and putting it into the frequency regulation market. We also, our view of this market internally is that while it may be roughly third on the hierarchy of value streams, RNS, FCM being the top two, frequency regulation maybe is the third value stream. It's likely to diminish over time as more and more storage resources are placed onto the ISO New England system and kind of eat into that available capacity in the frequency regulation market.
Yeah, it might be more difficult to participate in the market, basically, just because there's a saturation of resources that are trying to play in that market, right? Therefore, more risk. Yeah. Any other kind of grid service pieces you wanted to touch on?
The only other one that comes to mind is T&D asset deferral. That's something that you and I have thought a lot about, and it's a potential value stream that we have not realized to date, but is something that I think DERs, Powerwalls, EV chargers could be managed to do in the future. The management's going to look a little different than a peak service, right? Because right now we're calling on those devices 4 to 6 times a month. If you're talking about a transformer that's overloaded on a regular basis, right, the time at which you're going to be managing that is going to be different and look different and have a different value pass through and proposition to that participating member. But it's certainly, to your point of stacking various value streams, it's ones we're keeping an eye on and hope to bring into that stack at some point in the future.
Yeah, and you and I, from a technology standpoint, I think there's definitely some challenges at play there of how we make that a reality. And really one of the areas we're spending most of our time on is what is the value? What is the valuation of that asset deferral? And additionally, I would say, how do we build a member program to do that, right? How do you get someone to buy in to manage their charger 24/7, as an example? Are we going to be sending out opt-out emails every time this happens? How do we maintain the trust with that member that their EV is charged in the morning? and how valuable is it to actually defer that asset? I think right today we give an $8 a month bill credit for our EV chargers, $6.40 per kilowatt per month for Tesla Powerwalls, which are fairly decent numbers. It's $100 a year for the EV charger. Could be significantly more if you got a 10 kilowatt Tesla Powerwall on an annual basis. And, if we could at least match those values, maybe double those values, then those programs could be really effective. And if we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of transmission upgrades that are coming down the pipe, there could be significant value in us shaving load for a handful of hours a year, right? It could likely be, at least for the transmission example, that we're only looking at 10 to 20 hours a year, which is much lower than the peak management program we do today, the transmission program. So that one's definitely, I think, exciting and definitely could add a lot of value to the programs we already have and hopefully get more folks to sign up. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today, Dan. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, a lot of good stuff. We'll probably dive further into some of these things. I know you and I touched on maybe a collaboration with GMP to talk about just the Powerwall program specifically and what we've seen and what they've seen. Maybe we can have that in the future, along with maybe some deeper dives on some of these other topics. But thanks for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Of course, always happy to have these conversations.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dan.
See ya.
I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. Dan plays a key part in our VPP programs, and his insights and background help us expand our programs to grid services like T&D asset deferral. If you like this episode, please click subscribe on YouTube or on Spotify, and we'll see you next time.